What's up guys, and welcome back to TechPlant. Today I'm going to show you a propagation experiment involving the Philodendron Melanochrysum. Let's check it out. To kick this video off, we are going to need a Philodendron Melanochrysum. Luckily I got mine from Loggies before they doubled the price for no reason, so I'm going to show you how to take some cuttings and make more of these things. Like most of my propagation videos, we do have to identify the node, and this one is quite easy. It is where the leaf kind of meets the vine, and you'll see some kind of aerial roots kind of poking out there, and that should be a good indication. Once you've got your nodes identified, we're just going to cut about 1 inch to 2 inches on either side. It depends on your node spacing, but try and give as much space equally to each node cutting, and do not cut the actual node, just around it. For this video, I'm going to experiment with 2 different types of materials, one being sphagnum moss and the other being perlite. We're also going to mix the two to make kind of a hybrid approach and see which one performs best. I did use plastic bags to kind of prepare my media, and that way I can get the sphagnum moss and the perlite pretty wet in preparation for the propagation. For this to work, you have to make sure that this stuff never dries out completely, because the moist water is what's going to help our propagations root and continue to grow. Now that all my media is mixed up quite well, I'm going to transfer these over to cups, and then we can start planting our propagations. I'm using clear cups for mine just because it allows me to kind of monitor the progress without having to pull things out, but you can use something else if you really want to. However, I do think the clear containers make it a lot easier to see what's going on inside without disturbing the roots or the plants. So all you're going to do is fill up your cups with the medium and make sure you bury the node portion of the plant about 1/2 inch underneath the substrate. This will guarantee that they get enough moisture and water to root properly and to continue growing. The Philodendron Melanochrysum, I honestly hate these Latin names, but anyways, they really do prefer quite a bit of humidity, so I'm going to put some bags over them just to kind of help them jumpstart. I noticed that my mother plant has been doing quite poorly because it's in a pretty dry room with a fan on all day pretty much, and it hits like 84 degrees at times, and it's just not looking that great. So humidity is definitely preferred. I did take the top cutting, and I'm going to test it just rooting in straight water to see how that works, but I'm kind of unsure of it. I do prefer sphagnum moss and perlite for most of my propagations. Alright, I started these on May 14th, and it has been about 2 weeks, so let's take a look and see how the cuttings are doing. Starting with the perlite and sphagnum mix, you can see that there are no leaves on these nodes. I noticed with this species, once it starts putting out new growth, it almost always kills off the old leaf and kind of continues its growth from there, unlike some other plants I've used. But I don't really have too much fear. They're starting to grow, which is good, and I'm sure I'll see roots pretty soon. Do watch for this to happen though, because if you leave those rotting leaves on there, it could affect your plant overall. So make sure to pluck those leaves off once they kind of get loose and feel ready to come off. Next up is the perlite one, and I did put a little sphagnum moss on top just to try and keep a little moisture in a little better, and it seems to be working well. This cutting actually has some roots sticking out, which is pretty fantastic, and quite a bit of new growth. Here you can see what I was talking about the rotting leaves though. You really have to watch for this so it does not affect your propagations. Looking at the second cutting, and I was actually pretty shocked at the root growth in this one. This cup is interesting because if you kind of saw when I pulled the first one out, it was actually a little bit more in the sphagnum moss than it was the perlite, but this other one was purely perlite, and the root growth is crazy. You can also see the growth tip of the new kind of vine portion coming out of kind of behind the leaf, so it's doing very well. I decided just to take the sphagnum moss away and just stay with just pure perlite for this experiment, and I'm sure we'll do fine. Next, we're going to have our pure sphagnum moss one. These are doing okay. You can see that the roots are starting to protrude, but it's nothing like the cup beforehand. If you look really close too, underneath the leaf, you can see it's starting to push out new growth. However, the new growth has not killed off the new leaves yet, so I'm not going to tear them off until, again, they start turning a little more orange-brown. It was only a few days later after the footage I just showed you that I did take a look at the water propagation one, and I just didn't see much growth or anything happening, so I decided to abandon the water again, kind of like I did with the Rhaphidophora tetrasperma stuff, and I'm just going to try and grow it in perlite because we did see the last time the perlite cup was doing really well. I flat out ripped one of the leaves off just because it was in bad shape before jamming it in the perlite, just to kind of accelerate everything and give it its space it needs to grow. I wouldn't suggest ripping off good leaves like I did though, but I'm kind of experimenting. It has been an entire month now since the first cuttings, and here's the parent plant. I'm showing you this just so you know that they will bounce back and produce new growth, just like this one has, and you don't have to worry about taking cuttings. Alright, it has been about 1.5 months, and here we are. Let's take a look at everything and see how they're doing. This time we're starting with the pure perlite cup that I did top off with sphagnum at the beginning but took it away, and we'll get them out of there. But even before pulling them out, you can see that it's got some pretty good new leaf growth, which is very exciting and promising. Once I got them out and on the table, up close, they look actually pretty fantastic. They all have really good root growth, and they're all pushing out new growth and beautiful leaves. I would say perlite is definitely a good way to go, And as far as how I'm adding water, I'm just making sure there's like a 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch of water at the very bottom of the cup, and the perlite usually does a pretty good job of wicking it up to the top as long as you have some kind of humidity dome. Next up is our sphagnum moss perlite mix, and just from looking at it kind of briefly, it doesn't look that exciting compared to our perlite cup. I don't see any crazy growth coming out of it, but let's get them out of the cup and let's kind of inspect and see what it looks like. Up close, they do look okay. It is nothing like the perlite ones. I mean, they do have some roots, but there's nothing like really prolific. Most of it's like 1 or 2 roots at max, and they're only about 1 inch long. But it does have some new growth, which is kind of good. I mean, it's definitely not dying, but they're not growing as quick as the pure perlite cup. Let's move on to the next one. Here's the pure sphagnum cup. This one actually looks excellent from above. It has lots of new growth and multiple leaves. I'm not going to pull it out yet to check the roots just because I'm not ready to repot these things. So all we can really do is inspect the outside because I don't want to kind of tear it from the sphagnum moss because this stuff grips in quite nicely. Lastly, we have the little bag of perlite. These were cuttings that we took once we realized the water wasn't doing much after about a month. So I think since we're at a month and a half now, it's been about 2 weeks and these are rooting quite nicely, but it still doesn't look the same as the cup method. I think it's because I used the bottom of the bag and the perlite is really fine powder and it's just not working nearly as nice as the chunkier stuff. Alright, it has been 2 full months since we took our cuttings, so let's check them out, see them, and pull them out of their containers because we're going to pot these babies up. Let's start with the sphagnum moss one since I wasn't able to show you the roots last time, but now we're going to pull it out and really check them out. This is kind of one of the pain points of sphagnum moss. It really grips onto the roots and it's kind of hard to distinguish what's a long strand of sphagnum moss and what's a root, so you do have to be quite careful when pulling this apart, and that is definitely where perlite kind of has an advantage, is it's a lot easier to like remove it from the roots and identify where the roots are. After peeling away most of the sphagnum moss, you can see that they've done pretty well. One definitely did a lot better than the other, and you could maybe blame that on which node it ended up being, where it was cut from, was it the top or a lower one? I don't know, but for the most part they did pretty good. You can see some new growth kind of getting stuck and rotting away, and I think that's because I kept my sphagnum moss a little too wet at times, and I took the humidity domes away kind of maybe 2 weeks before this, and I think that may have caused some issues. Next up is the sphagnum moss perlite hybrid approach, and you can see it doesn't look very different from some of the previous footage, and we're not seeing any crazy growth, but let's pull it out and check it out. Seeing them up close, I can see that they did just fine. They're somewhere in between the pure sphagnum moss, the smaller one and the bigger one, so I think they fared pretty well. They have a good root structure and they do have new growth. However, it's not super impressive, but it's steady growth and I like it. Next up is the original pure perlite experiment. Here's a good example though, first before we pull out, of kind of what the water level looked like. It kind of looks high in here, but once I dump it out and show you, you can see there's not a ton of water in there. Like I said, about a 1/2 inch in a cup this size will do you quite well, and you can see how it leaches up the sides. Let's get to the cuttings though and see how well they did. For the most part, the cuttings do look pretty fantastic. They have a really established root system, and you can see not too much stuff is sticking to it, so it'll be easy to repot. However, I might have left this one get a little too wet and the water a little too old, only because you can see a little bit of root rot and the leaves are affected ever so slightly. But we can just snip off the rotting roots and we should be good to go when we repot this. Lastly, we have the kind of emergency from water to perlite one. Let's get it out and check it out. For being about 2 weeks behind, they still did pretty good. Again, I think that using the bottom of the bag perlite is really more like powdery. I don't think that was a good idea. The bigger, chunkier stuff is far better, I think, for this. So make sure you have a fresh bag so you can get the good sized portion stuff and not just powder like I did for this portion. However, it still worked out pretty well. There's some good root structure and some decent growth. Now it's time to kind of pot these up, and the soil mix is going to be pretty important for this style of plant. As far as the soil, you're going to want a very airy mix, and that means putting a lot of perlite, wood chips, and other large things in there just to make sure it drains rather quickly, but yet still actually holds some moisture. I know it sounds very strange, but you don't want like a bunch of soil to compact around the roots or they will start rotting. I prefer using plastic pots just because they're actually quite flexible, and if you feel like you overwatered, the next day you can kind of squeeze the pot a bit and it'll break up the soil around the roots and let air get down in there and kind of help prevent root rot. Again, that's why that airy soil is so important. For most of these, I ended up potting the node about 1 inch or 1.5 inches underneath the soil. You could probably go a little less, but I just want to make sure that the roots don't dry out and they stay nice and moist. Because I'm pretty confident in my soil mix, I'm not too worried about over rotting by planting them a little deep. If you want this plant to really thrive, you should give it a little slightly larger pot where you can fit in a big moss pole and have it climb a moss pole, because that is what's going to give you those big beautiful leaves that most people want out of this plant. and you're going to want to be able to keep it in a bin somewhere where it can maintain humidity. Once you get them potted up, kind of give them a little bit of a watering just to moisten up the soil, and don't drench it too much because these things do have to kind of acclimate, so you don't want to do any crazy swings on this thing. Just a normal watering and they should be good. Since I always forget to mention it, I did keep these things under grow lights for about 15 hours a day during the entire propagation period, so they did get a significant amount of light. I'm not sure whether that helps or not, but for me it seems like the more light I give most of my propagations, the better off they do. Alright, lastly, this footage is from September 15th, so it has been a total of 4 months since cutting, and you can see everybody is still alive and doing well. I have not had these in a humidity dome this entire time, and they have kind of suffered quite a bit. They've been attacked by spider mites, which I absolutely hate, and a lot of times the leaves were getting messed up because they couldn't come out of their growth pattern. I really don't know how to describe it, but they couldn't get released properly because there just wasn't enough humidity. Recently though, before releasing this video, I don't have any footage of it, but I put them in a big bin, like a giant clear bin, and they're doing significantly better with the higher humidity. So I definitely recommend you getting clear bins or making sure that you have a pretty solid humidity area for these things to grow in. Well guys, that pretty much sums up our video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope these tips give you confidence for propagating your own plants. In one of my next up and coming videos, I'm going to be talking about kind of my new initiative to get some of these more rare plants much cheaper, so that way other people can afford them, because right now the prices are ridiculous. But that's for another time. As always, may your plants grow strong and healthy. I'll see you next time.